There is a map of West Virginia from 1921 that you will not find hanging in any classroom. It is not a map of counties or rivers or state roads. It is a map of ownership. And on that map, the lines between private property and sovereign territory blur in ways that should make any careful reader stop and look again. In that year, in the hills of Appalachia, something happened that the federal government would later describe in official records as a labor disturbance. Newspapers at the time called it an insurrection. The men who lived through it, miners who worked 12-hour shifts 6 days a week, who paid rent to the same company that paid their wages, who bought bread from the same company that owned their homes, called it something simpler. They called it the only thing left to do. But here is the part that does not quite fit the official story. Here is the part that tends to get folded away into footnotes. By the summer of 1921, an estimated 10,000 armed men were marching through the mountains of Logan and Mingo counties. The United States Army was deployed against American citizens on American soil. And within a few years, the entire episode had been quietly reclassified, reframed, and in many corners of the country, simply forgotten. The question worth asking, the question this story keeps returning to, is not only what happened in those hills. The question is why so much effort went into making sure we would not ask. To understand what broke open in 1921, you have to understand what had been building for decades before it. The American coal industry in the late 19th century was not simply an industry. It was a system. And the company town was its most perfect instrument. By 1920, an estimated 1/4 of all Americans living in company towns resided in communities owned entirely by the corporations that employed them. In West Virginia alone, the number of company-owned towns in the coalfields stretched into the hundreds. Places with names like Holden, Pursglove, Kmore, names that appeared on no independent municipal record because they were not municipalities at all. They were property. The mechanics of the system were elegant in a cold sort of way. A coal company would purchase a tract of land, sink a mine shaft, and then construct everything a working community might need: houses, a store, a church, sometimes a school. Workers arrived, often immigrants from Poland, Hungary, Italy, and black men from the American South who had been recruited with promises that the mountains of West Virginia were free of the Jim Crow laws that governed their former lives. What they found instead was a different kind of boundary. You could not own the house you lived in. You could not shop anywhere but the company store. In many camps, wages were not paid in United States currency at all. They were paid in scrip, a form of credit token that could only be redeemed at company-owned establishments. A man could work a full month and never touch a dollar that any bank outside the county would recognize. The Baldwin-Felts Detective Agency was the enforcement arm of this arrangement. Founded in the 1890s, by 1921, the agency employed hundreds of private detectives who served effectively as a private police force for the coal operators of southern West Virginia. They evicted families. They broke up union organizing meetings. They carried rifles and were deputized by county sheriffs, who were themselves often selected with the support of the coal companies. The distinction between corporate security and public law enforcement had, over the course of 30 years, become nearly impossible to locate. Sid Hatfield, the chief of police of Matewan, a small town at the edge of Mingo County, was one of the few public officials in the region who did not operate inside that arrangement. On May 19, Hatfield confronted a group of Baldwin-Felts agents who had arrived to evict union miners from their company-owned homes. What happened next became known as the Matewan Massacre. 7 Baldwin-Felts agents were killed in the gunfight that followed, along with the town mayor and 2 miners. The agents killed that day included Albert and Lee Felts, brothers of one of the agency's founders. The event sent a tremor through the entire structure of the southern coalfields, and it began a sequence of events that no one in power seemed entirely prepared for. Sid Hatfield was acquitted of the Matewan killings in 1921. He became, in the months that followed, something close to a folk hero in the mining communities of Mingo and Logan counties. Miners traveled from distant camps simply to shake his hand. His acquittal was interpreted not only as a legal outcome, but as a kind of statement that the system could be questioned, that its enforcers were not untouchable. On August 8, 1922, Sid Hatfield walked up the steps of the McDowell County Courthouse in Welch, West Virginia, to answer a separate set of charges related to a mine dispute in Mohawk. He was unarmed. His wife was at his side. And on those courthouse steps, in broad daylight, in front of witnesses, he was shot and killed by Baldwin-Felts agents. No one was ever convicted of his murder. The official account of what followed describes a spontaneous and disorganized uprising. Miners, outraged by Hatfield's killing, began to gather. Within days, somewhere between 10 and 15,000 armed men had assembled at Lenz Creek, near the town of Marmet. They intended to march to Logan County, where Sheriff Don Chafin, a man widely reported to have been on the payroll of the coal operators, had for years maintained a reign of enforcement so complete that union organizers entered the county at genuine personal risk. What makes this moment strange, what gives it the quality of something slightly out of time, is the degree to which it was organized. This was not a mob. Contemporary reports, including those filed by military intelligence officers who observed the march, noted that the miners moved in military formation. They had designated leaders at the front of each column. They had a system for acquiring food along the route. Some carried union cards. Many wore red bandanas around their necks, which led the press to call them the Redneck Army, a phrase whose original meaning has been almost entirely lost to history. The red cloth was not a symbol of radicalism. It was a recognition signal, so that miners could identify each other from allies and informants in the darkness of the mountain passes. The question the official record never quite answers is this: how does a spontaneous uprising organize itself with military precision within 72 hours, and who exactly was giving the orders? When historians began examining the archives of the United States Army's Military Intelligence Division in later decades, they found something that had not been widely reported at the time. Federal agents had been monitoring Union activity in the West Virginia coalfields for months before the march. Reports filed in the summer of 1921 suggest that military planners were aware, well in advance, that a large-scale confrontation was building. The precise nature of what the government knew, and when it knew, it remains a subject of careful academic debate. What is documented is the response. President Warren G. Harding issued a proclamation on August 30, 1922, ordering the miners to disperse. When they did not, he authorized the deployment of United States Army forces, including airplanes, some of the first military aircraft ever used against American citizens on domestic soil. The planes were initially sent to observe and to drop leaflets. Later, testimony, disputed for decades, suggested that some aircraft may have been used to drop explosive devices on the miners' positions. The Army's official records from the period show that bombs were transported to the airfield at Kanawha City. Whether those bombs were dropped remains, to this day, officially unresolved. What is also documented is the role of Sheriff Don Chafin of Logan County. Chafin had built what amounted to a private army. He employed hundreds of deputies, many of them paid not by the county, but by the Logan County Coal Operators Association. By his own accounting, in later years, his operation collected thousands of dollars per month from the coal companies in exchange for keeping union organizers out of the county. He had machine gun emplacements along the ridge known as Blair Mountain. He had observation posts. He had a communication network. When the miners' march reached his territory, what followed was not a riot or a clash, it was a battle. The Battle of Blair Mountain, fought between August 25 and September 2. Ichen Jobei Arshii was the largest armed insurrection in the United States since the Civil War. The archives of the United Mine Workers of America, housed in West Virginia and Ohio, contain correspondence from this period that has received relatively little public attention. Letters from local union officials to the national leadership describe conditions in the company towns with the clinical precision of people who have grown used to cataloging injustices miners find for talking to organizers. Families evicted in winter. Men blacklisted across multiple counties for attending a union meeting. One letter, dated June 1921, describes a miner who was followed for 3 days by Baldwin-Felts operatives after he was seen reading a union pamphlet. He was eventually dismissed on the grounds that his work performance had been unsatisfactory. When you step back from the specific events of 1921 and look at the broader architecture of what had been constructed across the southern coalfields, certain patterns begin to emerge with uncomfortable consistency. The company town system was not unique to West Virginia. Historians studying this period have documented nearly identical arrangements in the copper mines of Arizona, the steel towns of Pennsylvania, the lumber camps of the Pacific Northwest, and the textile mills of the Carolina Piedmont. In each case, the pattern follows a recognizable sequence. A single industry acquires control of land, housing, commerce, and local law enforcement within a defined geographic boundary. A private security apparatus is established, funded by the industry and nominally deputized by local government. Dissent is managed through economic leverage, the threat of eviction, termination, or blacklisting before it ever reaches the stage of formal legal suppression. Historians of labor in this period have noted that the Baldwin-Felts agency was not an anomaly. It was one node in a much larger network. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency, which had been operating since the 1850s, provided similar services across the country. W 1892. The Pinkerton Agency employed more agents than the United States Army, had active duty soldiers. The implications of that fact, when you sit with it, are considerably. There is a particular detail in the congressional testimony that followed the Battle of Blair Mountain that researchers have noted as curious. When senators questioned military commanders about the decision to deploy Army aviation assets over American civilians, the responses were careful and narrow. Officers answered only the specific questions asked of them. Documents requested by the committee were provided in some cases weeks after the hearings had concluded. The final report, issued in early 1922, concluded that the miners had been manipulated by outside agitators, a finding that critics at the time noted was convenient for everyone involved, except the miners themselves. There are voices from this period that were never entered into the official record. They survive in fragments in the pages of small regional newspapers, in handwritten testimonies collected by labor organizers, in oral histories recorded decades later, when the men and women who lived through these events were old, and their accounts were considered by most institutions to be beyond the interest of serious documentation. A woman named Maudie Thurman, who lived in a company town in Boone County during the summer of 1921, gave an interview to a West Virginia University archive in 1974 when she was in her late 80s. She described watching company guards walk through her neighborhood in the weeks before the march, counting the houses, noting which families had men of working age. She described the particular silence that fell over the camp the morning after several men did not return from a union meeting across the county line. She said she never found out what happened to them. She said, nobody asked. A Hungarian immigrant miner named Janos Kovacs, whose testimony was collected by a union official named Ralph Chaplin sometime around 1923, described being brought to Logan County with a group of other recent immigrants, with the promise that the work was steady and the pay was fair. He described being met at the train station by company representatives who told him and his companions that they had arrived in a union-free county, that they were expected to sign a document acknowledging this, and that any contact with union representatives would result in immediate termination and eviction. He signed the document. He said he did not know, at the time, that the document he was signing had no legal standing whatsoever under the laws of the United States. Nobody had told him. A letter, found among the papers of a Logan County physician, donated to a historical society in the 1980s and catalogued but rarely cited, describes the doctor being called to treat wounded miners in the aftermath of Blair Mountain. He notes in the letter that he was told by a company official not to discuss the number or nature of the injuries he treated. He notes that he complied with this request. He does not explain why, though perhaps he did not feel that an explanation was required. Perhaps, in Logan County, in 1921, compliance of that kind required no explanation at all. The official death toll from the Battle of Blair Mountain is listed in most historical accounts as somewhere between 50 and 100 people, but the methods by which this number was established have never been fully explained. The battle took place across a mountainous frontier roughly 25 miles long. Many of the dead were buried in isolated locations by the people who found them. No systematic accounting was ever conducted by a neutral authority. The records of Logan County from this period have, in several documented instances, gaps that archivists have noted without explanation. Approximately 1,000 miners were indicted following the battle. Of these, a small number were convicted of murder or treason. Most cases were eventually dismissed. The men convicted were later pardoned. This outcome, which might appear to represent a form of justice, has a different texture when you examine the timing. The pardons came quietly, years later, after the moment of public attention had passed, and after the political circumstances that had made the prosecutions useful had changed. Don Schaffer, the Logan County sheriff whose private army had held Blair Mountain against the miners' march, was eventually charged with violating federal prohibition laws. He was convicted, fined, and served no prison time. He lived until 1954. The coal operators who funded his operation were never charged with anything. The Baldwin-Felts detective agency, following the deaths of its leaders at Matewan and subsequent legal pressures, eventually declined. But the men who had worked for it did not disappear. Many went on to positions in local law enforcement across the region. The institutional knowledge, they carried the specific skills of surveillance, intimidation, and the management of dissent within closed geographic communities did not evaporate with the agency that had employed them. And then there is the question of Blair Mountain itself. The site of the largest armed uprising of American workers in the 20th century was, for most of that century, unmarked. No monument, no historical marker visible from the road. In 2009, Blair Mountain was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Within months, at the request of coal companies operating in the region, it was removed. The removal was later found to have been procedurally improper, and the site was relisted. But the episode, the attempt to erase the physical site of the event from official historical recognition, sits there in the record. Quiet and unexplained. Like so much else from this story, there is a particular kind of forgetting that is not accidental. History has accidental gaps, records lost to fire, to flood, to the simple entropy of time. But there is another kind of gap, which has a different shape. It appears at consistent intervals. It follows a recognizable pattern. It tends to be most pronounced around events that complicated the interests of powerful institutions. Whether this constitutes deliberate erasure or simply the natural drift of attention towards stories that are easier to tell, that is a question historians continue to debate with great care and without final resolution. What we can say with confidence is this. In the summer and fall of 1921, tens of thousands of American workers lived inside a system that controlled their housing, their commerce, their wages, their access to legal protection, and the physical boundaries of their daily existence. When a portion of them attempted to alter that system through collective action, they were met with a private army, a hostile county government, and eventually the armed forces of the United States. The story of what happened, the full story, with all of its texture and ambiguity and forgotten testimony, was not the story that most Americans read in their newspapers that autumn, and it is not, by most measures, the story that most Americans have been told since. The miners who marched on Blair Mountain were not radicals imported from foreign ideologies. Whatever the congressional report concluded, they were men who worked underground 6 days a week, who lived in houses they could never own, who paid for groceries with tokens that were not money, who watched their neighbors evicted for speaking at meetings. They were men who had looked at the map of their lives and realized that the boundaries on it were not boundaries they had drawn. Maybe that is all this story is. A labor dispute in the mountains, significant in its scale, resolved by the intervention of federal authority, gradually absorbed into the general record of American history. Maybe the gaps in the archive are simply gaps. Maybe the silence around Blair Mountain for most of the 20th century was simply the silence of a story that people preferred not to revisit. Or maybe the reason this story feels like something recovered from a sealed room, the reason it carries the particular quality of something that was not meant to be found, is that it asks a question that remains, even now, genuinely uncomfortable to answer. Who owns the ground beneath your feet? And what happens when someone decides to collect,